Hello and welcome back to Beyond Boxes. This is a podcast episode, which means you can listen wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch right here on YouTube. Today, I am so happy to be joined by Sophia Graham. Welcome, Sophia.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. So, before we get started, can you let us know which labels, if any, you identify with?
I think the primary label I identify with is queer. So multiply queer, actually. Queer in terms of my sexuality, in terms of my neurology, in terms of the way my body works. So multiply queer, I guess, is the primary way I identify. I also identify with white and with being a third culture kid, which I think actually is also a racialized identity in some ways, because it's not really an identity we would usually give to people who aren't white.
Interesting. And I'm sure we can do a whole episode on that one day. And today we're going to be talking about more around disability. And you said that you identify as neurologically queer. So do you want to say a few words about what you mean by that? And then also a few words about, do you identify as being disabled? And if so, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, I identify with disabled. I think it's kind of part of my queerness as well in some ways, because it's kind of a queer relationship with your body. And I am queered by the world. The world kind of sees me that way, especially when I use my wheelchair. I'm an ambulant wheelchair user, which means that I can walk. And also it's easier to get around using a wheelchair sometimes. So I can walk for about 12 to 14 minutes. And pretty much everyone knows that that is not enough walking time if you want to do most things. So I would never be able to get around like an aquarium. I would never be able to get around a shopping mall, around an airport, without using some form of mobility device. And I've tried other devices in the past. I used to use a scooter, which was super convenient. But after I had spinal surgery, it wasn't an option anymore. So I don't use that anymore. I use a manual wheelchair with a powered add-on. And I'm NeuroQueer as well. So that means that I am not neurotypical and I have a bunch of different neurological differences. So for me, that's things like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia.
Interesting. And so obviously you're a sex and relationship coach to, as you like to say, quirky queers and cultural renegades, which I love as a description. And I'm really enjoying the way that, we're using queer as a very much an umbrella term. So often queer is used specifically to describe the LGBTQIAP+ community, but it's also a really great word to describe anyone who goes, well, beyond boxes, beyond the social norms, beyond, and so talking about it in terms of your relationship with your body and in terms of being neuroqueer, as you say, or not neurotypical is really interesting to hear. And, I think there's a few things there's a lot of things I want to talk about today, but it's interesting you mentioned the ADHD, because you were a big part of me actually getting diagnosed with ADHD. And, notice, and a few people had asked me if I might have it before, and I was very dismissive. And just 2 days ago, I got my official diagnosis from my neuropsychologist.
Congratulations. That's an awesome moment.
Yes, it was quite an impactful moment, just seeing all of that written in black and white and all my whole history, but we won't get into that too much. But I think what was really interesting was the way you told me that, how it can present really differently in women rather than men, in adults rather than children, how often women of color particularly are underdiagnosed in that. So let's take a few minutes to talk about that. And then I also really want to talk to you about your experiences of being a wheelchair user, but also being able to walk, because I think that's an interesting point too.
Yeah, it's a challenging one for much of the world, I think. So first off, I want to say, I think the ADHD and autism also, and probably lots of other impairments, I guess dyspraxia and dyslexia for me, the process of getting diagnosed is so deficit-based. And that's kind of shitty, because it doesn't have to be that way. that's the way it has to be to fit in with the racist and sexist classification system that we have, the ICD and the DSM. But I don't think it's a particularly helpful way for many of us of understanding ourselves. So it's a really helpful way of accessing support. It's a really helpful way of getting the medication that we need and fitting into the medical establishment. And I think it's also kind of traumatizing. It really focuses us on what are the deficits associated with our impairments. What are the ways in which they make us different and maybe difficult for other people and for fitting within what is a really ableist society. And I think it makes it really hard to have a more neuroqueer perspective where we're celebrating unmasking ourselves, where we're celebrating becoming more ourselves, becoming more in touch with what it means to be us and what it means to be the kind of, you know, queer crip that we are, that I am. Does that make sense?
It does. And it's interesting that you talk about it in that way. And I think, you know, there's so many stigmas associated with it. And for me, you know, just having that label, it helps me understand myself, and it helps me explain certain of my behaviors to those around me. And, you know, Mel and I had a great chat recently about, Mel Cassidy and I had a great chat recently about the fact that, like, the pros and cons of labels, basically, that they're really great for finding community. They're really great for having a descriptive language that can mean, you know, different things to different people, but that is the flip side, is that it can mean different things to different people. So whilst it can be helpful for some, I think especially, you know, you and I probably don't have the same experience of having ADHD, and that's in part because we have different intersectionalities of identity. That's in part because of our life history, but it's also because we probably don't have the exact same symptoms, right?
Right.
So it's really, yeah, it's interesting that you talk about it in that way.
Yeah, I think our neurocognitive profiles, when we're not neurotypical, are typically really spiky. So we'll have lots of skills in one area and lots of like abilities in one area and not so many in other areas. So I am pretty good at reading people. I am pretty good at chunking up tasks, but I have such a hard time with names. And right now I'm going through a citizenship process in America where I have to pass a test to prove that I know enough about civics and history of America in order to actually get citizenship here. And I have a really hard time remembering the difference between Madison and Jefferson in particular, because of the way those names sound and look to me. And it's taken a really long time to be able to make that memory of who each of them is stick. And it's only because I'm connecting Jefferson to a guy I studied with called Jeff, who was independent. And then I'm like, okay, he's independent. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. And it's really wild, the kind of things that the steps you have to go through in order to address a deficit, say. And I definitely have difficulty with nouns and with people's names, and that's one of the areas it really shows up for me.
Interesting. And I love that little insight into your mind about, you know, the associations that you need to make to remember things. And for example, for me, I'm usually really good with names. That's something that comes really easily to me, but there are other things that are much more difficult. And so whilst we're on the topic of, you know, different experiences of neurodivergency, neuroqueerness, as you say. I quite like that term. I think, you know, there's also, first of all, would you say that being neuroqueer is a disability?
Well, because neuroqueer is such a political identity, it's not a diagnosis specific identity. I think it's explicitly disabled. I think if you take on the neuroqueer identity, it's part of a political movement. And that political movement is queer people coming together to unmask ourselves, to talk about, to talk in ways that are authentic to us, and to accept that there's a whole range of different ways of being in the world that are queer, and neurologically some of us are also. And so yeah, I think NeuroQueer is definitely a disabled identity. I think neurodivergent may or may not be, depending on the person who's at question, right? So if you've taken on a NeuroQueer identity, I think probably 100% of people will identify with disabled also. But if you're saying I am autistic, or I have ADHD, or I'm dyspraxic, you may or may not identify that as a disability. And I think that's a personal question.
And I guess it's personal based on the person's experience and how they choose to identify. And it's also person to person based on, you know, where they are on the spectrum, for example. Like a lot of these conditions, and this is true not just of neurodivergent conditions, but of most forms of disability, there is a spectrum. And I think this is where it becomes interesting, right? Because people can have a very closed-minded and fixed idea of what disabled looks like, and that tends to be someone who is in a wheelchair, who can't walk, who you know, is that little symbol on the blue badge, right? And that's the only way anyone who's disabled looks like. So let's talk a bit about your experiences of being a wheelchair user, but also being able to walk 10 to 12 minutes, I think you said it was, and the reactions you get from people when you stand up, because I went through a phase in my life where I was also needing to use a wheelchair, and the look of like judgment and disappointment from people if I stood up was quite striking, let's say. So I'm curious to hear about your experiences.
I don't like to stand up if I'm using my wheelchair, if I can possibly avoid it. And that's because people have a lot of thoughts and judgments. I think there's part of it is internalized disableism. People are afraid of disability, and people assume if you're using a wheelchair, it must be because there's literally no other option for you in the world. And it's the only thing that you could possibly do. So if you can walk, if you're not somebody who's got, say, a spinal cord injury that prevents you from walking, then anything would be better than being in that thing. And that's completely the opposite to my experience. My experience is actually wheelchairs open up my life enormously. They allow me to do things and give me the freedom that I don't have as a walking person. I'm in much more pain if I'm walking rather than using my wheelchair. I'm able to do less things. I'm able to see less things. And also there are drawbacks because people treat me differently. People sometimes in social situations don't speak to me because I'm at a different level to them, right? Or people treat me like I'm stupid, or there's all kinds of ways. And also you can't always get into things. Lots of places have a step to get in, and there's no ramp, there's no way to get in unless I get out of my wheelchair. And if I get out of my wheelchair, then there's the social consequences to that. So it kind of puts you in a difficult situation. And there's so much discrimination. One of the things that I do with one of my partners is address that discrimination through legal action sometimes. Right. So I've sued several organizations for discriminating by having steps, or discriminating by having other access barriers, lack of information, poor practice when trying to search me, all that kind of stuff. But it's really difficult to do and time consuming and energy consuming. And you really do have to make a judgment call about, do I have the energy to do this? And is it enough of a priority to do this right now? Because it's very stressful. It's very stressful. And the law that I use is the Equality Act in the UK. And I'm at risk of costs if I lose a case. So if I take a claim against a pub, say, who doesn't have a ramp, and I've asked them a few times, please, will you get a ramp? And I've written to them, please, will you get a ramp? It costs under 50 quid. Here's a link to it. And they still haven't done it. And I decide to take legal action against them. In the case that I lost that, I would have to pay their legal fees, which would be probably considerably more than any money I would be awarded for if I won the case. So it's really difficult and tricky to take action in the UK. And it comes up a lot. Literally every time I go out in my wheelchair, there's at least one place I can't get into. Unless I get up.
Right, exactly. And so, you know, I know that for myself, when I was needing to use a wheelchair as well, same thing, I could walk, I think even less than, I could walk a few steps, but you know, that was about it. But the tube station nearest my house was not a step-free tube station. And I remember like going to Pride in a wheelchair, and people were so friendly and warming and welcoming, and everyone wanted to take a picture with me. And it didn't feel too pitying, but it did feel a bit over the top, right? I was like, and then the look on people's faces when occasionally I'd need to stand up to do something, because we'd get to a pub and it didn't have a ramp and there was a step. So I was able to just stand up and get over that step. And it made my life a lot easier to do that in that moment. But the shame and that internal idea of like not wanting to, or the times that, you know, I would get to the tube station and then stand up and whoever was with me would fold up the wheelchair and carry it. And I'd sort of walk up the steps or something, and people's looks. And occasionally I travel, and you know, if my friends would get off at a different stop, or I wouldn't have anyone with me, so I'd have to fold up the wheelchair and carry it up the steps myself. And again, people would just look at me like I deceived them, you know.
Yes.
And it was like, and I totally agree with that kind of idea of, you know, venues need to be more accessible, there needs to be more wheelchair access, there needs to be more, you know, step-free tube stations and stuff. But it's also awful that those of us who can make our life easier by taking a step feel like it's easier to not in that moment because of the cultural, I don't know if it's conditioned, the cultural ableism, right? The societal ableism, which is so prevalent.
And it's the idea that if you can take a step, then you're cheating the system, and I think it's actually very similar to the sorts of things that happen to trans folks when someone discovers their assigned gender. There's like this moment where it's like, oh, you deceived me, you deliberately did this thing, you're a fake somehow. And that's not accurate. That's not accurate in either case, right? But I think it's a really common reaction, and it's really unpleasant. And it does stop me from getting out of my wheelchair in many situations. I think one of the more difficult situations actually is at airport security. Right. So trying to figure out, do I want to be searched? And that search can be quite intrusive. They nearly always touch areas of your body that they wouldn't touch if you were a walkie person. Or do I want to go through the scanner, let them search my wheelchair? Last time I did that, they actually took off the seat cushion, which is part of the structural integrity of the chair, and put it through the scanner, which meant that I couldn't put it back on in the right place for it to give the wheelchair the right support, give me the right postural support. So it was really uncomfortable for the rest of the journey, and I actually still haven't fixed it. So they can do things, if I get out of my chair, they're going to do things to my wheelchair, and I don't know what things they're going to do to it. And it's always a surprise, you know? And so there's also that question. Do I get up at airport security, or do I let them search me? And it adds these questions. I think these questions are kind of part of the labor of being a disabled person, right? So we have, as well as the physical impairment and as well as the societal barriers that we're facing, we have to make all of these decisions all the time about what mobility device do I use in this situation? If I use this mobility device, how am I going to interact with people in this situation? So my favorite mobility device is my e-bike. And I use that, especially in COVID, probably 95% of the time. If I need a mobility device, it's my e-bike. And the reason is I can go much further on it than I can in my wheelchair. It takes me to the destination, and then I can do things at the destination. So it will take me to the grocery store, and then I can use the grocery store's card, or it will take me to my mate's place or to a lake or to wherever I want to go, which I couldn't get to on foot. The car doesn't bring me close enough to actually get to the thing I want to do in many cases, but my e-bike absolutely will get me there. But then recently I went to a Dyke Fest. It's usually a Dyke March, but it was a Dyke Fest in the middle of Boston. And it was that decision: do I take my wheelchair, which would mean I could get into places and get on the public transport, or do I take my e-bike, which would mean that I could get between places more easily, but then I'd have to find somewhere to sit down. And sometimes finding somewhere to sit down that's close enough to what I want to do is really challenging, especially if I don't know the place. And so there's that cognitive load, that extra disability work that we have to do just to exist in the world, that as an able-bodied person or a temporarily able-bodied person, I didn't have to do. And I think you have to do different kinds of the same sort of work if you're neuroqueer in many cases. You have to do lots of kind of decision making and thinking through a lot more of the consequences and a lot more of how does my impairment interact with the social world that I'm trying to engage with. Than absolutely. If you're a non-disabled person.
What's really interesting in that is, again, remembering or reminding non-disabled people, you know, or people that don't have these sort of like marginalizations. Like you say, there's like three big things, right? There's the physical impairments that we have to deal with. There's the social and cultural judgments and, you know, like lack of structure and lack of accessibility that we have to deal with. And these two elements are true of all types of disabled people, I think. And then finally, there's all these choices, and those are different for people who are like full-time wheelchair users, for example, versus those of us who aren't, but they are still decisions that take up a lot of mental energy and mental labor, and they are exhausting. And like today, I'm totally wiped out and exhausted, and I had to make that decision about, you know, I really want to do this interview with you. I really want to have this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation to have, but I also really wanted to look after myself and have a nap. And, you know, and then I was like, but if that shame of like, not even shame, but like, oh, am I allowed to cancel? And I was aware of the irony, right? I was aware that as someone who also has chronic health conditions and is disabled, that you would probably be very understanding. But I'm also aware that, yeah, but then, you know, the consequences of that, of I have a limited schedule and all of this, which, you know, for starters, a non-disabled person wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. If they were tired, they'd have a coffee and they'd be fine. Whereas when I say I'm tired, that's not what I mean. There's a kind of sense of like full on, like right now, the brain power required to have this conversation is so much more intense. My vision has gone completely blurry as I've been talking to you. I'm in like a lot of pain. I can really feel my joints and my legs, particularly. I get a lot of pain in my lower body a lot of the time, you know, are really hurting. And it's not obvious to someone who's watching this interview right now, you know, it's not obvious. I seem like I'm bubbly and I'm enjoying this conversation and I'm chatting. And I think, you know, there's definitely these elements for those of us who have, well, let's define, what do we mean by invisible disability? Is there such a thing as an invisible disability? Is it really invisible? And let's talk some more about that.
Yeah, I mean, invisible disability is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because we met and I looked at you and you looked at me and I was like, oh, I wonder if this is a bendy person and a person who's some type of neuroqueer. I'm curious, right? And there's nothing specific about you that made me think that, but in our very first conversation, those thoughts came up for me. And I think we recognize each other. It's a bit like gaydar, isn't it? You kind of see somebody who's walking down the street and clock them and are like, are you queer too? And I think that's very similar for so-called invisible disabilities, because I don't think that they are invisible to everybody. I think they're definitely invisible if you're not paying attention. I think a lot of impairments are invisible if you don't know somebody particularly well. I think they get more visible as you get to know people. And I think it's really interesting to start speaking to people and to then make that decision. Is this something that I bring up in this context? Is this an appropriate context to have a conversation about, I think we might share an impairment? Is that something that's okay to have a conversation about in such a disableist society, where actually owning that you're disabled is kind of frowned upon? It's not really an acceptable thing to do. Definitely parents don't think, oh, one day I hope my kid grows up to be disabled. You know, it's not a point of pride for many people. And also living within a community of disabled folks and engaging with a community of disabled folks is profoundly wonderful in many ways, right? It gives you this access intimacy that Maya Lingus talks about, which is a different kind of experience than you would have with someone who's, say, neurotypical or non-disabled, because you just get things in this kind of fundamental way. And I'm sure it must be true across other categories of marginalization. I know it's true when I'm in a group of queer people that I have some of those feelings too, but it's not quite the same. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I think I'm curious to know about, so neither of us were born with an obvious disability, as far as I'm aware. Well, at least I was not born. I'll talk for myself. So I think I was not born with an obvious disability, right? And you know, I had symptoms as a child of things that weren't quite right. I was getting ill more easily than the average person and things like that. As a teenager, things got quite bad, but people were taking me to lots of doctors. By people, I mean my parents were taking me to lots of doctors, and they couldn't quite find what was wrong and just sort of were very dismissive. And then, you know, I hit my early 20s, and then I got various viruses and was also sort of burnt out, and then was bedbound for 6 months for the first time around. That was in 2013 or something, I can't remember. And then a few years later, I got glandular fever, and then that was the time I was bedbound for 15 months and actually that was when I was using a wheelchair to leave the house. I literally couldn't walk more than like 5 minutes without, you know, taking a break and catching my breath. And I think around that time, it became a little easier to use the word disabled. But even before I had that like burnout in 2017, I think it was, you know, a friend of mine was trying to sat me down and was like, you need to take it easy on yourself. You need to start using the word disabled. And I really, really struggled with that word. I had so much, not just internalized ableism and shame about using it. And the word shame's come up a few times in this conversation, right? But also this idea of what disabled meant. And I was not this idea of what, you know, that I had about disability. To be fair, I also really struggled to come out as like bisexual or pansexual or queer, because I also had like very fixed ideas about what that meant, and I didn't quite meet those. And it's not, I kind of do meet that criteria now, but I didn't at the time. So I think it's interesting to talk about, you know, the ideas we have around these labels and what happens when we don't fit in those boxes, to not keep referencing my the title of this podcast. So I'm curious about you. Were you born with an obvious disability? Is this something you've experienced your whole life? When did you start using that word, and what was your journey with your disability like?
Yeah, so I was not obviously disabled when I was a small person, but I was variously called clumsy and lazy and someone who didn't pay attention. And I would be great at this if only I paid more attention. That was like almost a constant refrain.
Yeah.
I had real trouble not getting drawn into fiction and into books. So in primary school, I had this one experience where I just kept reading a book under the table, and I'd answer the questions when I was asked them by my teacher, but I was kind of swinging on my chair for the stimulation. I was reading this book under the table, and he ran across the classroom, jumped on the desk, and went, and I fell backwards off my chair with like, oh my goodness. And it's an obvious moment that he was really frustrated by my inattentiveness, right? By that particular presentation of ADHD. And he was not the only teacher that did something like that. One of my other teachers like grabbed my bag and threw it out of a classroom because I was doing the exact same thing in high school. It clearly really pressed a bunch of teachers' buttons. And that was never seen as anything that could be ADHD related or problematic. And at the time I was living in the global South, we didn't have access to a bunch of the things that I would have had access to if I'd have been living in the UK. And I was also really, like I said, clumsy. And I have very unstable ankles and wrists. I was injuring my ankle really regularly because I really like to play netball and other sports. And yeah, it just hurt a lot. And I had lots of ligament issues. But again, that wasn't really picked up. Similarly, my parents told me that I wasn't allowed to do social sciences because my handwriting was too poor. So I wasn't allowed to do history or any of the social sciences classes because my handwriting was too poor. And that's obviously dyslexia. I'm clearly dyslexic, but that wasn't picked up either. And even when I went to university, I did a remedial spelling class because although I'm pretty bright, cannot spell. And it helped a bit. But again, there were a bunch of opportunities for that kind of stuff to get picked up. And they really weren't for a long time. But what I did have was asthma. And I had asthma that was really triggered by dust. And when I was growing up, we had wood floors because I lived in the tropics. And wood floors don't really hold dust mites. I moved back to the UK and carpets are horribly present. And I started getting really bad asthma symptoms and difficulty with breathing, difficulty with tree pollen. And at the time I was doing a course on labor, basically HR, trade unions, where I came across the DDA, which was the regulation from 95 onwards that protects disabled people in the UK. And I got to understand the British definition of disability that applied legally and saw that I fit that category. So the legal definition in the UK is you have to have an impairment that has a substantial impact on your day-to-day life. And substantial actually means more than minor or trivial.
Okay.
So I had an ongoing impairment that lasted longer than 6 months that was impacting my day-to-day life and stopping me from being able to breathe and being able to concentrate and focus. And I used that to get a non-carpeted room in halls by leveraging the Pre-Equality Act law, the DDA. And so from then I started identifying with disabled because I could see that it was useful to me in one way, I guess. And also because it fit my asthma. And as time has gone on, it fits more and more of me, right? So it fit my asthma in that moment, but it also fits my wheelchair use and my back stuff and my hypermobility and my neuroqueerness. Like all of that comes within this kind of, it has an impact on my day-to-day life because of the way the world is structured in this moment and because of the kinds of things that I do.
People in your life, how did they and how do they respond to that?
It's an interesting question. I think my dad thinks I'm super litigious and I don't think he approves. My mom has always been someone who was very pragmatic and does what works. She's actually very interested in doing what works. And so she will use a wheelchair when she needs to, and has done. She will use mobility aids when she needs to, and always has done. And I think part of the reason that I had an easier time with starting to use a wheelchair and other things is because she sees them much more neutrally than most people do, which was helpful to me. When I became a mobility device user, that was actually at the prompting of one of my partners. One of my partners at the time was a full-time wheelchair user and was like, so Sophie, since your car accident, I'm noticing that your life has shrunk. And I'm wondering whether that's something you've decided, or whether that's something that's just happened because you can't figure out how to do it any other way. And I can help you with getting a mobility device if that's what would help. And at the time I was like, no, I don't need anything. And then I thought about it a little and I was like, oh, I definitely need something. What were you thinking? Because that person is so good at finding the best thing. Like, she is amazing at finding the best thing to help with a particular disability related problem. She's done it for lots of people, not just me. And she really is fabulous at that. I hope she listens to this podcast and gets that compliment. And she suggested an e-bike at the time. And later we talked about which scooter would be best for me. And later we spec'd out wheelchairs. And I actually found the one that I currently use on eBay. And it was kind of perfect for me. But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't spec'd out what I needed with her and figured out like what the width of the chair needed to be and what wheels would be best and what power assist might help me and all of that stuff. So having access to someone that already had that knowledge really helped with acquiring a physical impairment. And I think there are different things that helped with acquiring diagnoses for long-standing neuroqueerness. So being recognized again by somebody who said, have you considered that you might be dyspraxic? Have you considered that you might be ADHD? I'm considering I might be ADHD, and I've noticed that you do some things like me, was, I think, is the only way for lots of people to get clued into that as a possibility.
Interesting. And there's a couple of things there. Number one, I hear you say to be ADHD. Now, I've had a really interesting conversation with someone where we talk about how they talked about how it was important to, and this might not apply to you, but the having a disorder rather than identifying fully as being a disorder, which I think is a really interesting distinction. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I heard that terminology. And I think it's wonderful that you've had all this support, that you've had, the example mirrored by your mother of, if you need the help from a mobility device, that's okay, that you had this partner who was like, hey, I've noticed this, how can I support you? That you've had people be like, have you considered that you might have this disorder or that disorder or this condition or that condition or whatever it is. And the way it's done is, of course, makes a difference. Like, I'd had someone ask me before about ADHD and I was very dismissive because of the way they said it to me. It was almost like an accusation. Whereas when you and I spoke for the very first time, when I was interviewing you for something and I came on and I was totally manic and speaking a million miles an hour and was like, yeah, so a couple of people I think might have ADHD, but I don't think I do, but and you were like, have you considered that maybe? And you were like really gentle and kind and asking me questions and giving me information rather than kind of imposing a diagnosis on me, right? Which then enabled me to then go off and do my own research, realize that there was a lot of things I resonated with, make an appointment with a neuropsychologist and go from there. Now, one of the things that it's worth talking about briefly is that it's not always easy to get a diagnosis. We've touched upon this a little bit already, but especially depending on the country you live in, depending on your gender, your age, other mitigating factors. I'm super lucky that I'm currently living in France and it was super straightforward and easy. And I got my diagnosis within like a couple of months, but I know that that's not the case for most people. So I really want that to be made explicit, that it's not always easy. And maybe we can talk a little bit about self-diagnosis and what your thoughts are on that, and also how to support getting a diagnosis and if that's needed.
I think the question of diagnosis is a really thorny one, right? I think for many of us, getting a diagnosis is hard. It's emotionally devastating, wipes you out for months, right? The process of just getting there. And I think it's a bit different for physical impairments versus neuropsych type stuff. So it took me a decade to get an endometriosis diagnosis. And that's not uncommon. Lots of people who are bendy take a decade to get an EDS or a hypermobility diagnosis too. But I feel like that's a little bit different from the process of getting a neuropsych diagnosis, because I don't know, that just feels like there's something different, particularly for me, about dyslexia and dyspraxia. I feel like I really am dyspraxic. It's just like all over me. It's in how I think, it's in how I behave, it's in everything about me. I would be a different person if I wasn't dyspraxic, for example. And I'm not sure I'd be a different person if I wasn't asthmatic.
Right.
I'm not sure I'd be a different person if I had not wobbly joints, although I think the wobbly joints are a little bit related to the dyspraxia too. And it just feels so fundamental to me, this kind of dyspraxia and ADHD stuff, that it makes it even more invalidating when you have trouble getting the institutional support for it. And I think it makes it more tricky and more emotionally difficult to go through some of those processes. So I've supported people going through the process of getting diagnosed in the UK through the NHS. And I know people who've got diagnosed in other places in Europe. I got diagnosed in the States, but it's really tricky here too. And adult diagnosis for autism and ADHD is incredibly difficult. So it's possible, but actually the way I got diagnosed was by reaching out to people through a Facebook group for queers and looking for someone who was queer, who'd had a good experience of getting diagnosed in my local area. And the person that responded was a Black trans guy who'd had a good experience with a white psychotherapist and recommended her. And I was like, if she worked for you, I'm pretty sure she's going to be all right with me too, you know, because he had even more intersecting marginalized identities than I did. And so I think finding ways to get through the diagnosis process is tricky and difficult. And I think self-diagnosis is a different thing. I think that's kind of important. I think everybody gets to self-diagnose. I don't think that you need a doctor's stamp of approval. And at the same time, it can be so validating to get it. And it can really help with that process of talking to people that you love about this is what's happened. Other people believe that this is accurate. Because often caregivers don't really like being told that there's this stuff that's been going on for you all of your life that they didn't notice. Yeah. And it can be really hard to have those conversations.
I just had to have that conversation with my parents, right? That, you know, I've had to, since the pandemic, I've moved back in with them, in part because of the pandemic, in part because of my own health constraints. And so I read out my neuropsychological summary, and I think that was quite impactful for us all. I, you know, could choose which bits I did read out, and then I had to like sit them down and be like, this is what's going on for me. This is the support I need. I need you guys to recognize that I am disabled, and I don't use that word lightly. And I have so many friends and family members being like, but why do you say disabled? That's such negative thinking. Just like, you shouldn't use that word. Just think positive and you'll be fine. And it's like, you know, people wouldn't say that to someone who, you know, had a broken leg, for example. Just, why are you saying you have a broken leg? Just think positively and you'll be fine. And it's like, my disability is totally valid and legitimate and real, and my symptoms fluctuate, my need for mobility aids fluctuate, my energy levels fluctuate, my capacity to function on a daily basis fluctuates, yes, but it doesn't matter how much positive thinking I do, I am not going to heal. I am disabled for the rest of my life. And I have come to accept this. I have 17 diagnosed incurable chronic health conditions. There is no waking up one day and a magic cure. And so anyone who tells me that they have a magic cure for me, I'm automatically, you know, suspicious of. But people who say, you know, I have some of these conditions, or I have a friend who has these conditions, and here are some treatments that was supported with some symptoms, or have you considered this, or, you know, then that's great. I don't mind that, you know. But when people are like, you just need to try yoga and then you'll be fine, I'm like, okay, but my mother is a yoga teacher. I've been doing meditation and yoga my whole life. I am far, far, far from fine. So, you know, and I think it was difficult for my parents to hear that. And I think, you know, it's not new, my disability, by any means. Like I said, I had symptoms from childhood. I've had 3 periods of my life where I was totally bedbound for long periods of time. But the people in my life still really struggle, because when you look at me, I look okay. I look, you know, and especially in the moments where I'm functioning a bit more, I'm working at the moment, not full time, but I'm able to do some work, and I have a bit of a social life, and, you know, and then that doesn't mean I'm better. And people, when I say, hey, I can't meet up tonight because, you know, my health has taken a bit of a crash, like, oh, get better soon, or like, oh, or whatever it is. And it's just, it can be really infuriating. So I wonder if you have anything else to add around all of that.
Yeah, I think those conversations with parents and caregivers can be so tricky, and conversations with partners too, about this is what I need, and this is what I can do, and this is what's difficult for me. And I think having those conversations with other disabled people is usually so much easier. And I've found that actually I just click better with disabled folks generally. So I am more likely to date other disabled queer people than I am non-disabled people, even if they're right at the beginning of that journey, you know, even if they've recently acquired an impairment and are just kind of coming to terms with that, which is a difficult moment for most people. I find it easier to have these conversations. I find it easier to acknowledge each other's stuff and to mirror each other's stuff, and to have that kind of intimacy that I'm looking for in my connections with people. So most of the people that I've been dating recently have been queer and disabled in one form or another, often neuroqueer. I like other neuroqueers. I think neuroqueers are excellent humans in general. Yeah. And it's a challenge to feel entitled to those identities without some kind of official document. And it's important to validate that people are entitled to those identities with or without official documents. And it's important to acknowledge the limitations of that and where it becomes difficult because we have family members that we're trying to connect with or trying to talk to, and people who are not disabled who just don't have the same frame of reference that we do.
And do you have any advice both for people sort of starting on their journey of either because they've newly disabled, especially, you know, with the pandemic, lots of people now are dealing with long COVID or with, you know, repercussions from having had COVID, and are finding themselves like unable to function in the ways that they used to. So either for people who are newly disabled, or people who are just coming to terms with it, or people, you know, so do you have any advice for them? And then I'm curious if you also have advice to caregivers and supporters and friends and partners.
I think for folks who are newly coming to terms with becoming disabled, find a disabled community. So if you're on Facebook, look up chronic health groups, look up disability related groups, look up groups around disability and sexual intimacy. There are a bunch of them all over the place, and they are invaluable spaces for validating yourself and your experience. And if you have a particular impairment that's maybe an uncommon impairment, like say EDS, for example, lots of queers seem to have EDS, then consider a disability specific group as well, because sometimes those can be really helpful at linking up what other impairments are likely to arise as a result, and how can I get myself fast tracked into having those recognized and getting support with them. I think that's really invaluable. So I'll start there. But I think I love DBT skills because I think they give us a lot of skills to navigate the world more effectively. And I think doing something like support with DBT skills, getting support with psychological skills that help you to cope with your emotions more effectively and help you to communicate with emotions more effectively. I'll go back into DBT. Yeah. Dialectical behavior therapy. It's a therapeutic approach to supporting people with dealing with emotions, helping with interpersonal interactions, and coping with distress. And it's a skills-based approach where little tiny skills build up towards a toolkit of things that you will have at all times that you can use to navigate tricky emotions, intense distress, and interpersonal interactions. And I think emotions are usually more intense when you're getting diagnosed with anything, and definitely when you're acquiring an impairment. And being in a group that has people who are also disabled, preferably that is taught by people who are disabled, makes a massive difference to being seen, recognized, understood, and having your experience just mirrored to you. I think we talked about mirrors and windows recently together.
We did.
But I think having your experience mirrored as a disabled person acquiring an impairment makes all the difference in the world to coming to terms with it for yourself and being, I don't know, comfortable with yourself, feeling okay, feeling like you're entitled to these labels. And these labels aren't the end of the world. There are lots of possibilities. There are lots of wonderful lives that you can lead.
And I think that element of mirroring is so important, especially for those of us who belong to any kind of marginalized group, right? When we're not being mirrored in daily life, it's, you know, sometimes they say like, I can't date straight cis white men anymore. And people immediately, well, when I say people, straight cis white men immediately get very defensive and like, why not? You're being discriminatory. And the reality is I'm not closed off to falling in love with anyone, right? But the reality is that straight cis white men and I will not be able to mirror many of my experiences. They will not be able to understand and share and understand what I experience on a daily basis through being queer, a person of color, disabled, you know, presenting as a woman, all these experiences. And I'm, you know, especially non-disabled straight cis white men. And it's exhausting being around someone who doesn't mirror one's experiences. It's exhausting having to explain and justify and, you know, take the time. And it's like even the anecdote I was saying about trying to explain my disability to my parents, you know, that in itself was exhausting. And that's just one thing I've had to explain to them, because I don't have to explain my racial identity, right? Because my mom's Black. And yet that's just, so when it's a partner who is part of your, you know, you're sharing intimate moments in daily life, you don't want to have to be teaching them everything constantly. You want it to be a meeting and partnership. And so it becomes very uneven when you don't have that mirroring from the people you care about. And do you disclose your disability when you meet new people, how, like, early on, or does it depend, or does it?
All of my dating profiles, so like I'm on OkCupid and a bunch of other well, not that many other places right now, but all of them have that I'm disabled. It's like right out there up front, because why would I go on a date with someone who thought that was a problem? It would be of no interest to me. It's really great for partner selection. I'm into reducing the pool of people that are interested in me. I'm fat and I'm disabled. That does a great job of doing that. And I find it helpful to be really explicit up front about what it is I'm looking for and who it is I am. Because I really do want partners that fit with me. I really don't want partners that are misfitting. I thought I was done with guys, but it turns out I'm not. And I think I am not done with queer men who have at least one other marginalized identity. I think I can take queer men that have at least one other marginalized identity, but otherwise I'm done with guys. That's just not my wheelhouse, you know? Yeah. But it is interesting to revisit these things. And I'm very explicit about what I can and what I can't do, what I am and what I'm not interested in, what kinds of dates I want to go on and what I don't want to go on, what kinds of activities I want to be doing and what I don't want to be doing. Because I feel like that's a really helpful way of getting into, will we fit? Will we fit well enough to have enough connection for this to be an awesome thing to do together, or not? And if not, I think for friend selection and for partner selection, there's just not enough time. Why would I do that to myself? Why would I allow myself to be drawn into the possibility of something with someone that's just going to be really misfitting with me? And that's where I'm at with it.
Agreed. And so going back to, do you have any advice for parents, caregivers, partners who are supporting people who are disabled?
I think it's really helpful to find communities as well for allies. I would make an exception to that in terms of some of the communities around partners of autistic folks, because some of those are super toxic and unpleasant. I wouldn't go there. But otherwise, I think finding communities, particularly queer spaces, if you're a queer person, around being a supportive person for somebody who's disabled. Or but I'm not sure where else I would go. Maybe do some reading, maybe read some of the really wonderful books that are out there by disabled activists about the care we need and the world that we imagine that we could be in. And I think that's probably where I would get started. I guess it's really similar to dating someone with another marginalized identity. Like, you need to actually have some understanding of what the experience of that is like and take it from a political activist perspective rather than from kind of a medicalist caregiver perspective. I think it's the same. But yeah, definitely, if you're a partner of an autistic person, do not go to those support groups. They are really toxic.
I really appreciate that distinction between, not taking a medical approach. Like, if someone's disabled, especially if they've been diagnosed by doctors, they already have that medical support. That's not what they need from their caregivers and the people in their lives, their friends, partners, family members. They need that kind of support, that kind of, and I think as well as reading books, educating yourself, trying to understand the experience, it's also listen to the person in front of you, listen to what they're saying, and always ask, how can I best support you, rather than assuming you know better than them.
Yeah, for sure.
Brilliant. And so before we come to an end, how do you feel that you're an ally to people belonging to groups with either more intersections of oppression than yours or groups with different marginalizations than yours?
Well, I think ally is complicated, isn't it? And it's a little troubled in some ways. Nevertheless, I think I am an ally in a bunch of different ways. I guess I do lots of work. I expected to be a therapist for quirky queers, disabled people, and also poly people and consensually non-monogamous relationships, and also kinky people maybe. And actually what I ended up with was a practice half filled with sex workers. And being an ally to sex workers for me is all about supporting the Rights Not Rescue model, supporting sex worker-led organizations, supporting decrim, supporting lots of different aspects politically. and also in my practice, making sure that the spaces that I facilitate are sex worker friendly, that people aren't coming into those spaces with views around sex workers need rescuing or sex workers need criminalizing and all of that kind of stuff. And also, I'm very pasty white, and I've had a racialized identity for decades because I grew up in a country where I was not in the dominant group, right? So I knew about my whiteness from when I was about 8. And my whiteness really informs how I move through the world and how I'm understood and read and how I'm treated. Like, I'm in an immigration process right now that is made much easier by my whiteness, so much easier. And with the DVT groups I run, one of the groups I run is for queer disabled people. And I have no cost and low cost spaces for people who are people of color, because they're more vulnerable and because they're underrepresented in that group right now. And because it's important to me to expand access to supportive spaces for groups that are not typically in those spaces. And that's the same for all of my courses. Actually, I offer specific additional discounts for people of color in particular, because I think that's important. So I guess I put money into it. That's one of the ways that I'm an ally. I put money and work into it, and I do my best to be conscious of identities that I don't share, and conscious of when microaggressions and aggressions come up in those spaces, and to be receptive to correction and to not be too fragile when I'm corrected. Because of course I will miss things, and of course I will be clumsy about things because I don't share those experiences. And I am not infallible. And I don't want to be. I don't want to be. I would prefer to be better with some things, you know, but yeah.
And I think that's a really important point to make. And I think, you know, a big part of being an ally or trying to be an ally is humility, is acknowledging that we are going to fuck up. And when we do fuck up, it's okay, as long as we learn from that and do better next time, rather than getting defensive or dismissive. And I could do a whole talk on that, but I'm not going to.
Yeah.
Sophia, how do you go beyond boxes?
Well, we talked right at the start, which feels like ages ago now, about labeling and categorization and mental health stuff, right? And I was a therapist. I've moved towards more being a coach these days because I feel like it fits me better. So there's a beyond box thing, right? But I think the way that I do support with mental health really goes beyond boxes, because it's not so much about what is the label that you've been given, what is the name that's put on this, what is the type of neuroqueerness that you have specifically, towards what is it you need to access these skills, what support do you need from me to be able to do this work we're doing together effectively, and how do we learn effectively together these skills to help you to have the life that you'd like to lead and to build the skills that you need to build. So it's not about boxing people into the category of even disabled or ADHD or autistic or BPD or any of the other problematic labels that people who have distress get given from time to time. It's really about, how do we move from here to where you want to be, and what skills can I help with? And of course, where you want to be sometimes is a world where disableism doesn't exist. And we have to start from the reality that it does, and that we're living within that, and we have to cope with so many things as a result. So these skills are all about, how do we do that? And I think that's really an important way I go beyond boxes.
Fantastic. I love that as an answer. And so how can people who are inspired by that answer find out more about you and your work?
My website is the best place to find me. The website is loveuncommon.com, and I work with a bunch of other quirky queers. I think everybody on it that I work with is disabled in one form or another, or neuroqueer, or chronically ill, or one of those associated things. And we work together as a team a lot of the time. We do a bunch of different sorts of courses, and you can find out more about what they are on the website, which is loveuncommon.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
It's been great talking to you.
And for people who want to find out more about me and my work, my website is jayabristow.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at beyond_boxes.